Awesome. Yep. Got it. Okay. So welcome to the first session of the Concerned Philosophers for Peace 2021 conference. This session is going to be focused on environmental justice. I'm Jen Kling. I'll be chairing the session. Our first speaker today is Bill Gay, who will be speaking on the Earth Charter and the advancement of nonviolence, peace, and social justice. Our second speaker today is Danny Marrero. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your last name, who will be speaking about right attributions to rivers, a Latin American response to the violence and injustice against ethnic communities and future generations. We'll run this session where each speaker gets sort of 20 to 25 minutes to speak, and then 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A, and then we'll switch over. The session is scheduled to end at 10:10. And I will do my best to keep us on time. Sound like a plan? All right, so Bill, the floor is yours, sir. All right, Bill, it's all you.
Okay, I'm going to be focusing on the Earth Charter and some benefits that it might have for us on some of the issues we're working on nonviolence, peace, and social justice. Our theme connects our fragile planet, but also lists power politics. And it has a very major role in being responsible for the fragility of our planet. I would say specifically with capitalism, and in particular with the military industrial complex. Out of a list of a dozen or so items, just to note that these forces are exacerbating environmental devastation, they're widening the economic gap between developed and developing countries and between rich and poor individuals, and contributing to direct structural and cultural violence. Well, what is the Earth Charter and why should you care about it? Many of you may not even be aware of this document. It's only 2,400 words, a normative document. So if you're looking for a good text to stimulate normative reflection in your class, I would recommend it. It's rather accessible to the general reader. And it has 16 main principles, many on the environment, what's happening with the planet, but also ones that deal with issues of social justice and with violence. You have to get all the way to the 16th of the 16th principles for it to say specifically about the cultivation of a culture of tolerance, nonviolence, and peace. It calls, among other items, for implementation of comprehensive strategies to prevent violent conflict, to demilitarize nation states to the point of having non-provocative defenses, and to try to convert military resources to peaceful ones and to ecological restoration, and even to eliminate weapons of mass destruction. So in this sense, what we have is an important contribution to cosmopolitan values that offers principles that can sustain this planet and the life it supports, including particular measures needed to advance social justice among the people of the earth. It has 4 key principles, which I will just note. 1, to respect and care for the community of life. 2, ecological integrity. 3, social economic justice. And 4, democracy, nonviolence, and peace. The topic that has gained the most attention over the 21 years since the Earth Charter was completed has been sustainable development. The most has been written on it. There are hundreds of articles and dozens of books on these topics. Be a huge topic to try to tackle, and I'm going to avoid it except for a couple of comments. But it also aims to avoid irreversible environmental harm that results from economic and military activity. And it seeks to have gender equality and universal access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunities, and to preserve freedom of expression and dissent, as well as cruelty to animals and other items like that that many of us would affirm. What I'm going to focus on to a degree is the need to give a higher priority to decreasing militarism as a prerequisite for achieving the goals of the Earth Charter. well, some about, well, what is the Earth Charter? The United Nations has itself adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. When the Earth Charter came before it, it did not, and I'll say a couple of words about why it did not, though the Earth Charter has been endorsed by UNESCO. Coming out of the Earth Summit, sometimes called the Rio Conference in 1992, there were concerns about the environment and our fragile planet being expressed then. And over an 8-year period, the document that's now known as the Earth Charter was crafted. But the reason that the document was not adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations is that that body is dominated by developing countries. And for many of them, Western environmentalism is seen as anti-anthropocentric, which to them means that it's against new or developing nations trying to get into the ball game and to have development at the levels of the developed countries. And so in this sense, many of them viewed the Earth Charter as a guise for neo-colonialism. They're trying to dig themselves out of the holes that they've been in for so very long and would only support types of viewpoints some would call anthropocentric, but that allowed for sustainable development, which of course also means the continuation of development. And development is one of the major contributors to some of the environmental problems for the planet. Nevertheless, the Earth Charter can be a very valuable document to make use of in our teaching in public forums. And I would say as an aside, and I won't take the time to go into it, unfortunately, it's too tied to the modern state and the military industrial complex. But as an educational tool, it can help educate young activists and future leaders around the world, and it can prompt political action on a local to national scale. Let me mention just the three main figures behind the drafting of the Earth Charter. You've heard of at least one of them, maybe two. Stephen Rockefeller, who was at Middlebury College for a long time, a graduate of Union Theological Seminary, expert in world religions. He was the strongest intellectual force behind it, and he's still going, maybe not quite as strongly, but he's still trying to continue his work as an emeritus professor. Mikhail Gorbachev, which after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, he helped form the Green Cross International, and it has done considerable work in terms of environmental protection. And Maurice Strong, who was a former executive director of the UN Agency on the Environment. What happened when the General Assembly did not adopt the Earth Charter was UNESCO endorsed it. And what this allowed was for the United Nations to give housing and loose affiliated partnership to the Earth Charter. What it did was to establish housing at an education center at the University of Peace in Costa Rica. And this was in the year 2000 when Miriam Villalba was appointed the executive director. She'd actually been just a young woman at the Rio conference in 1992, but since 2000, she has been the executive director of the Secretariat of the Earth Charter at the University of Peace in Costa Rica, where she runs many programs, mostly graduate ones, for students around the world. And one of the central items on which they focus is on the Earth Charter and to a large extent, sustainable development. And one of the ones who's been the most active in this in terms of the education for sustainable development is the person in philosophy of education, Sam Kroll, who's a professor emeritus at Cal State San Bernardino. More familiar to many of you would be the Paris Accord, so let me make a couple of quick comparisons with the Paris Accord and the Earth Charter. The Paris Accord, sometimes called the Paris Climate Accords, is a legally binding international treaty on climate change that was adopted in 2015 and went into force in 2016. And it has two legally binding instruments, a convention on climate change and one on biological diversity, with the goal of keeping global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius, preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius. over the last 20 years, only a few philosophers have published on the Earth Charter. I've only been able, after considerable effort, to find 4. One of the early ones was Robin Attfield, who is a British philosopher in environmental philosophy. And in his one article, he focused on future generations. Another one who's only done one article more recently was Glenn Martin, who's a professor of philosophy at Radford University. And he basically wants to say the Earth Charter should look to subsume itself under the World Constitution. So he's a bit on the periphery. The one that's written the most is Bob Jinkling, a Canadian philosopher of education. And he's written many articles on sustainable development. I've already mentioned that's too big of a topic to try to tackle. The one person I would mention who's especially significant, though she only wrote 2 articles, was Victoria Davian, an eco-feminist who was the head of the philosophy department of the University of Georgia from 2005 until her untimely death in 2017. And she has 2 essays that I think are quite good. One in 2002 on ecofeminism, integrity, and the Earth Charter, and another in 2004 on the Earth Charter and militarism, an ecological feminist analysis. And it's more on ecological and feminist perspectives than it is militarism. And I'm going to elaborate more on the militarism. But she makes use of some of the work of Karen Warren in terms of connections of the abuses of nature and a variety of human oppressions. And wants to talk about the logic of domination from the issue of a purported moral superiority that humans have over plants and that they have over other organisms that are inferior, which includes humans such as women and many people in developing countries. But basically, their argument is that associating a group with nature supposedly justifies oppressive institutions over the interior. And so what she wants to try to do using ecofeminism is to look at the marginalized groups and to include in them not just women and other groups of human beings who have been oppressed, but also marginalized animals and plants. And in this article, she concludes, those working for social justice and those working for environmental protection should therefore be allies. This is an argument that resonates with me. It's one I've been making since 2002, in which I also include pacifists and multiculturalists along with the groups that she mentioned. As I said at the first, what I want to mention briefly so we can have discussion are some of the obstacles of militarism to attaining the goals of the Earth Charter. At the least, why proponents of the Earth Charter need to strengthen opposition to militarism. For simplicity, I'm going to focus on one of the ways in which militarism degrades the environment. And this is particularly in terms of emissions. And so if we look at fuel as a scarce resource and its release into the atmosphere, as Medea Benjamin notes, the Pentagon is the single largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels in the world. The International Peace Bureau has noted that the world's military forces are responsible for the release of more than 2/3 of the CFC 113 into the ozone layer. And in more practical terms that most people can get their mind around, Laura Steichen and Lindsay Kashgarian have noted that in a single hour, a typical military jet consumes as much petroleum as is used by the average automobile driver in 7 years. And they go on, if you want to look at related issues in terms of what global warming does to human populations and how it accelerates cross-border migration. And they estimate that by mid-century, as many as 200 million people will be involved in border migration. And what this also results in is increased militarization of borders. We've heard a little bit about that in this country. And of course, that means increased military activity around borders, which means continued release of emissions into the atmosphere that contribute to global warming. We hear some about nations needing to do something about their contributions to climate change and global warming, but very little about their military's contributions when they turn out to be the most significant factor in terms of those negative effects. And what I want to note is that this is a very comprehensive. One other person has written on this in 2001, Doug Wire, who wants to talk about how militarism and the military-industrial complex impede achieving these goals, is Doug Wire, and he looks at what it has done, the militarism does both before, during, and after conflicts. I've written more broadly on this starting in 2015 in terms of the negative impacts of militarism on the environment, that the direct consequences include production of military machinery and weapons, and secondly, their deployment and testing, particularly when we were doing above ground nuclear tests, but and so many of the other issues like fighter jet training. And thirdly, in terms of their use, I think we're all aware of the devastations of war. And then fourth, in terms of the storage and reprocessing over a long period of time. And those are just some of the key direct effects. If you get into indirect ones, you're starting to look at issues of jobs and resources, and how if we moved away from this direction, not only could we be helping the environment, we could also be helping human needs. I'm going to take a minute and soon bring this to a close so we can have more discussion to the role of CPP and similar organizations. Through our papers and publications and through our teaching and social activism, our members do a lot to try to advance peace and social justice. I've looked carefully, and most of you at some point have at least done so in a cursory manner, at our documents, official documents. In our Constitution, it simply says that we are dealing with issues of, quote, violence, war, militarism, disarmament, and peace, end quote. The website only says a little more, that we're, quote, the largest, most active organization of professional philosophers in North America involved in the analysis of the causes of war and the prospects for peace. And if you want the most elaborated one, in our philosophy of peace book series with Brill, as Danielle knows, in the documents there's even more elaboration, saying that the series explores socio-political ethical perspectives on modern warfare, peacemaking, conflict resolution, including the many forms of domestic global violence such as sexism, racism, classism. And of course, in none of these is there any reference to the Paris Accord or even more distantly to the Earth Charter. And I think that this lack of elaboration in our documents may be well advised. And if people want to know about what our memberships are doing in the organization, they're well served by going to some of the many volumes, over 24 now, that the organization has published. And I would encourage those of us who are teaching to consider the Earth document as a very good ethical document that you can bring to a class. You can do it for one day, you can indeed do a whole semester. There's so much in it to stimulate discussion and hopefully maybe even some action. So as a pedagogical tool, it's very valuable for advancing peace, social justice, and nonviolence. But what needs to happen with the Earth Charter, what needs to happen more generally, is we need to sharpen the critical perspective of the Earth Charter and of other activist groups on militarism. Even during peace, militarism is a major contributor to global warming and other forms of environmental damage, as well as to problems for many social groups. So I would say briefly and in conclusion, that if you want to advance work for the environmental goals of the Earth Charter, what you need to do first is to work against militarism. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that brilliant talk. Please join me in thanking Bill. Awesome and well on time, which for a chair is always a delight.
I dropped several sections as I was talking. That's what you have to do.
It always is. Oh my goodness, it's so true. But thank you for that. Oh my gosh, there's so much there. I have several questions.
Okay.
But as chair, I'm not going to start because that's rude. So we have a good 15 minutes for questions. So if you have a question or a comment disguised as a question that you would like to ask Bill, feel free to wave at the screen or raise your Zoom hand or put it in the chat, and we will go from there. Does anybody want to get us started? All right, Greg, do you want to get us going?
Sure. Hey, good morning, Gail. So, yeah, I really didn't have a question. I just wanted to thank Bill for bringing this to the table. Number one, the idea that we can use the Earth Charter now in our classes, I think, is a great idea as we're thinking about doing our syllabi. And then the idea of revising the CPP statements and our short statements about nonviolence. But then I was really struck by Bill's comment here that militarism is a threat even during peacetime. And I wondered if maybe in cutting out sections, maybe that was something Bill wanted to say a little bit more about the ways that we could talk about how peace philosophers would be interested in the damages that militarism can do even in peacetime.
There's so many topics that you could mention under the issues that you're raising, but there's very little discussion about how much the military is contributing to environmental degradation and to global warming. And we think it's a wonderful joy, besides watching a few of the billionaires go up a few miles into space and blow and use a great deal of fuel for no good reason. We say virtually nothing about military training and military exercises, supposedly in peacetime, and how many resources they use and how much pollution they involve. And I think trying to bring more attention to those issues is something we can do. And if you still want to say things positively about the military, parades to pollute the atmosphere a whole lot less than fighter jet flyovers do. People may like to see them, but it's a tremendous waste of resources that we do on a daily basis. And so to try to draw attention to that, I think, is important. And it's something that many people can reflect on and say, yeah, well, I'm told to have a fuel efficient automobile. And yet, even if I do a gas guzzler automobile, I'm not a competitor in a lifetime with a couple of days of activity by a military jet doing training missions.
Definitely. And as someone who lives in Colorado Springs, we get the Air Force fighter jets practically every day, right? Just above the house, going back and forth. It's very exciting. Any other questions for Bill? Gail, go for it.
Sorry, can I?
Yeah.
Sorry? Do you listen to me?
I can hear you, Luna. Go, Luna.
Okay, Luana, yes.
Luana,
Oh,
go for it.
So I was wondering about the correlation that you made between the ecofeminism and the militarism, the militarism rhetorics. As I come from Brazil, I have experienced that the military in our country is also responsible for taking care, I highlight this word, of Amazon. And this complicates the issue, right? Because in countries in the third world, it happens that military is also involved in protecting some portions of the environment, especially sensible environment in Amazon. And on the other hand, that would be the first comment. I would like you to comment on that. How do you feel about the military being responsible for providing security for the conservation? And also, secondly, in Brazil, there is also not only on the functioning of the army, but the very rhetorics of military is really entangled with the environmentalist counterattack that our president poses to the country. So I wonder if you would have a correlation to make, if you could make a correlation between the army rhetorics and the counterattack on environment that in countries as in Brazil, we can see nowadays, because it's all part of the same conservator rhetorics, right? It's all part of the same, paradoxically, liberal rhetorics as well. So if you could comment on that, that would be really good for me as well.
That's a good comment and a good question that you're raising for us. And some would say, well, yes, that's a better use of the military. Well, you need someone to help protect the Amazon. You need various jobs to be done, but the question is whether the military is the best force. I gave the illustration that one of the consequences of global warming has been increased migration, and we have largely a military response at our borders, and that contributes to environmental degradation. And I'm not familiar with the details of how the military may function in Brazil in terms of their activities in the Amazon. There may be some good, but that doesn't mean that environmentalist groups couldn't do a much better job. And they're much more likely to treat women and indigenous peoples more respectfully than traditionally has happened with the military. So my sense would be, if you can find an alternative, we're going to be better served doing that. And that's one of the ways, in terms of the indirect effects of militarism, to say that if you start putting money in other directions, you can put it into human needs. You can do it in terms of environmental protection. And I think that would be a much better option. But getting the political clout in order to pursue it is another matter.
Gail, do you want to jump in?
Yes, in some ways, my comments are related to this question of the forest. But I was first thinking of the US example, but now listening to Luana, I'm thinking of other examples as well. So for example, in Honduras, which I'll talk about tomorrow, you have the military that often lines up with vested interests like mining that are destroying the environment, instead of thinking the military's out there defending the environment. Mm-hmm. Here in the US, I don't know what you think, but on the one hand, I'm surprised that parts of the military come out and state, you know, global warming is a security hazard. And I mean, there are actually parts of the military statements that sound like they think we have to address the environment, even though in the meantime, they're flying planes that are harming the environment, but they make it sound like it should be an agenda. On the other hand, it would be great if the human power and human labor that we could gather through our military were used in things like fighting forest fires. I mean, and a lot of you live out west more than me, but I mean, just huge fires that I think are just destroying. I'd like to see some statistics, how many years I could drive my car compared to, you know, what can happen in a forest fire. But it's obviously one of those vicious cycles, right? It's the climate change that's led to the dryness, which leads to the forest fires, which puts more, you know, CO2 and others in the air. And so it is a vicious circle. But would it be good if the National Guard, I mean, there would be other ways, but if the military believed that global warming was a security risk, that we could relocate the human power to stopping fires. I mean, is there anything like that you think could be done? Are there any signs that the military could ever, by its own logic, make those changes in its priorities? Or, I mean, obviously we can as citizens try to emphasize that it should do that. But I just wondered what you thought about remobilizing the military to be more in sync with its own pronouncements about contemporary dangers.
Yeah, that's a good but complex question, and I left out quite a bit of that. Logically possible, yes, you could get the military to make those kinds of changes, and it may be worth trying. But you also have to compare the rhetoric that you have from the military with the actions of the military. There are statements you can find in terms of, climate change and all of that, but look at the record. And this goes back to the Cold War, and there's literature that I can point you to if you're interested in this, and how the military wanted to see if it could manipulate climate for strategic purposes in terms of storms or heat increases over the territories of adversaries, and in terms of where to dump nuclear waste, if not in the atmosphere, into the oceans. So the two are hardly in sync. They're in actual contradiction. And sometimes we bring in, National Guard and other groups to try to assist. So you've got some of the resources there, but you've got a structure that makes it very difficult to get them to truly have the commitment to do the types of work that need to be done. So the short answer is sometimes there may be a strategic and practical advantage, but without significant changes. And I would say demilitarization and conversion of military hardware and mentality is not going to really be what we need to have as our focus.
Okay, I'm going to now put myself in the queue.
Okay.
So, so I like this idea of using the Earth Charter, right, and then using that to sort of create a push for demilitarization, right, through the existing kind of international legal mechanisms that we have in place, right? But I'm a little bit worried. I think that by using international legal mechanisms, right, it reinforces a kind of carceral logic that implicitly depends on a certain kind of militarization, right? If not like the use of the military, right? But certainly the use of some kind of security force to then enforce the law, right? And so I have a little bit of a worry. I mean, I don't know how else to do it, right? But if we go through international legal mechanisms like the Earth Charter, right, and like sort of other similar mechanisms, we'll have to use certain forms of security forces in order to, right, create militarization, in which case I'm a little worried that we're reinforcing that kind of logic that does demand the use of this kind of power, which is so detrimental.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and it's a very good topic, and I've largely avoided it. But there are many in our group who are going to look at nonviolent strategies, and not only non-provocative defense, but nonviolent defense. I mean, the kind of work that Greg and the Acorn do, and that many of our volumes have done, are saying that there are responses that don't have to be military. So I have my own, as I said, reservations about turning to the military for that. But it's not like we are at a loss and that they are the only ones that know how to deal with these kinds of problems. And if there were more money given and more political clout given to environmental groups and to many other groups working for social justice, we've got the strategies that are nonviolent and that are effective. And I've certainly left all of that out in terms of how nonviolent strategies are more effective than ones that use physical force. And I think we can use our own talents within the membership to say, there's a lot we can say and what responses we can make on in relation to problems like these.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you, right? And I see that, right? I think I was just asking more about the use of the logic, right? Regardless of effectiveness of strategies, right? Thinking about that sort of legalistic logic and whether it needs to be sort of a question of what kinds of power can be used, right? And as you say, I think nonviolent power, right?
And what language we use. So you can go back to the time of William James and, moral equivalent of war. Well, why do we have to say that what we need is a moral equivalent of war? Why don't we just need simple, nonviolent, moral, social activism? That's what we need. So we've got a very deep mindset that's connected with a supposed effectiveness of the military's approach. And it's capital intensive and it's environmentally destructive, and there are much better alternatives.
I feel like cheering, Bill. I feel like I should just start cheering. Yes, let's all thank Bill again for a lovely, provocative talk that gave us a lot to think about at the start of the day. Thank you so much. So now we are going to switch speakers. So now we are moving over to Danny Marrero. Again, forgive me if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, who will be speaking to us on right attributions to rivers, a Latin American response to the violence and injustice against ethnic communities and future generations. Danny, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Don't worry about the pronunciation. Actually, I have to start apologizing because I learned English when I was old, so my tongue still resists to the right position. You will see my presentation, so don't worry. And half of my family, they say they are American, so they say that my last name whatever way they want, so don't worry. But it's fine. I love that. So let's see. Can you see this? Yes. Something moved in the screen. Okay. So I will just to help with my accent, I will have things like this so that you can read while I am reading at the same time. And so I want to clarify first that if you need to cut my presentation, it is okay. Just say, open your microphone and say, stop, it's time. And I think close to the 24 minutes, I've said everything that I need to say. And if I have to cut, it's okay. Okay. So this is a part of a larger, big project, Irresponsible. So that's why I know that I want to achieve everything. But what I am trying to do is to study some of the merits of philosophy of law and environmental philosophy in Latin America. And specifically in this presentation, I will focus on right for rivers. So I will start a presentation, and I was just a warning. It's just a part of a larger project that I've been working on. So you will see that there are rough parts and whatever. So I want to call your attention on the fact that environmental jurisprudence is going through a fascinating moment because rivers are being conceived as right holders in New Zealand, India, Colombia, Bangladesh, the Orange County in Florida, and the province of Quebec. In this presentation specifically, I will talk about the merits and contributions of Latin American jurisprudence for this strategy of environmental protection, attributing rights to rivers. And these specific ones, I think with this specific one, and for this conference, I will show that this is a response to the violent and injustice against ethnic communities and future generations. So I think that matches perfectly with the title of the conference. So there is this saying by the Wanganui tribes in New Zealand, which in English translates, the river flows from the mountains to the sea. I am the river is me. So I will use this saying as a rhetorical device to unify my presentation. In the first part, I will show how the non-trivial relationships between Afro-descendants, indigenous and mestizo communities and the Atrato River in Colombia was the inspiration of the Colombian Constitutional Court to attribute rights to rivers. And then in the second part, I will show how this strategy was the inspiration for the Colombian Supreme Court to confer legal rights to the Colombian Amazonia to protect present and future generations from climate change. So I want to start by presenting the general context in which the first group of rights was attributed, and then I will move on to the second one. So if we remember, the first part of the saying is the river flows from the mountains to the sea. And in this case, the river is the Atrato River, which flows from the western branch of the Colombian Andes Mountains through the north of the Colombian territory till the Gulf of Urabá in the Caribbean Ocean. This river is only 416 miles long, but its large discharge is not less than 175 cubic feet of water per second, and that makes it the second largest water flow in Colombia. Its basin is it is 24,854 square miles and extends from the northwest of Colombia to the south of Panama. And it is constituted by 15 tributaries and about 300 ravines. And it is also the most diverse ecosystem, one of the most diverse ecosystems in the world. It hosts 9,000 species of plants, 200 mammals, 600 birds, 100 reptiles, 120 amphibians. About 25 of these species are endemic, and finally, its basin is also rich in gold, platinum, woods, and it's considered one of the most fertile lands, agriculturally speaking, in Latin America. So this is a big target for a lot of resources around the world. Then the second part of the saying is, I am the river is me. And obviously the expression I in the original saying stands for the Wanganui tribes, believing that the river from which they take their name is sacred. But I will expand this expression for my presentation to Afro-descendant, indigenous, and mestizo communities living in the geopolitical area which through which the river flows, which is called Chocó. When this case was ruled, the population of this area was about 500,000 people. 80% of them were are Afro-descendant, 10% indigenous communities, 3% mestizo. And then the 90% of all this land is the collective territory of 600 Afro-descendant communities and 120 indigenous reservations at ethnicity of, indigenous reservations from one specific ethnicity called Embera. And the rest of the territory, which is around 4%, is inhabited by mestizo farmers that immigrated to the region. So the Atrato Rivers Basin has been the ancestry home for all these communities, and that has shaped their style of living. For instance, these communities perform practices of traditional agriculture scheduled around the river cycles. They farm local foods like corn and rice and chontaduro and plantain and cocoa and sugarcane. Their methods of fishing are traditional fishing, and mining is traditional too. And everything goes with the flow of the river. And I want to remark that this ontological connection with the river was confirmed by one of the exhibits introduced in the trial by the plaintiffs, in which several anthropologists claim that the river is the main factor of cultural identity in this region. I think that's why these communities, and because of this existential connection, that was the main motivation for these communities to sue the Colombian government, because from their perspective, there was an omission from the Colombian government to provide security and protect the environment. And this allowed the increasing of illegal mining and logging illegal activities in the basin of the river. And these activities used a lot of heavy duty machinery and toxic materials like mercury, and they bring huge environmental consequence to the river, and the river is deteriorating really, really fast because of these activities. And from the plaintiff's perspectives, is the omissions of the Colombian government the main cause of this deterioration. And this brings problems with, which is the legal case, specifically with the rights of the ethnic communities to live, health, water, food, healthy environment, their cultural ancestral territories are not protected either. So I don't want to go to the details of the legal procedure, but it is important to notice that the lower court taking the case originally, the judges didn't granted the protection because they thought that the case didn't need extreme judicial intervention. Then the Colombian Constitutional Court overturned the decision And this is the backbone argument of the court. So I will go through the argument. For the Colombian Constitutional Court, the protection of the right to a healthy environment is especially relevant for Afro-descendant and indigenous communities because a healthy environment is a necessary condition to guarantee the continuity of the lifestyle and ancestral traditions. In other words, the protection of the right of healthy environment of Afro-descendant and indigenous communities is a necessary condition to guarantee other fundamental rights such as their collective identity and their cultural identity. The reason for this is that the right of a healthy environment that belongs to these ethnic communities goes beyond the mere protection of the biological diversity. Better yet, it is a necessary condition for them to enjoy their own territories. When environmental deterioration doesn't allow ethnic communities to satisfy the basic needs of their individual members, such as health and personal integrity, those individuals are forced to displace to another places where those basic needs are guaranteed, or at least they are not threatened in a direct way. And then the court goes saying, if the members of these communities are forcibly displaced from their own lands, not only their lives, the lives of these individuals and these communities are negatively affected, but then all the network protecting these communities is eroded. And for what matters in this conference, I want to notice that in all this narrative, the court uses the wording of forced displacement to refer to this moving of ethnic communities, which is remarkable in a country like Colombia, because we have the highest, or in Colombia, they have the highest numbers of forced displacement in the world. And so just to clarify, the main cause of forced displacement in Colombia has been the ongoing armed conflict that has forced more than 7 million of people to move to save their lives. And the court uses this idea to state that the right to live is not only includes biological existence, but also material, cultural, and spiritual conditions allowing individuals to have a dignified life. And from this, for the court follows that the individuals of ethnic communities will also be fleeing for their lives when in their ancestral territories, their basic needs are not satisfied. So I want to go back to the backbone of the argument of the ruling. So they found the antecedent of the conditional in the hypothetical syllogism that I put in the screen to be the truth. That is, the court found that the environmental deterioration of the Atrato rivers basin doesn't allow the ethnic communities living in the area to satisfy the basic needs of their individual members. And they do comparisons like these. So for the court, this environmental deterioration becomes evident when we see, we compare the areas in which logging and mining is happening, which is the two pictures to the left, with the original flow of the river, which is the picture to the right of your screen. So from these comparisons, the court inferred that the river has clearly deteriorated. And the sandbanks and artificial branches have been deteriorated the river natural flow. And then even this environmental deterioration, the basic needs of the ethnic communities living around the Atrato River cannot be satisfied. And then it goes on that healthy has been affected because the fish is contaminated with mercury, and the population has a big amount of above normal mercury in their blood system. And then the right to food of these communities also violated because given the mining and the deforestation, the farming through traditional methods is disappearing. And then they add several arguments to show that all this affect the traditional forms of subsistence of these communities, and that clearly the rights of these communities were violated by the omissions of the Colombian government. So as a consequence, the court mandated several measures to protect and restore the river. To restore the river, and also the existence of the ethnic communities. So the court recognized that the very existence of the ethnic communities around the river were at risk. So the court, to solve this problem, the court declared the Atrato River as a subject of special protection. And indeed, the court recognized the river and its basin and its tributaries as an entity with the rights of protection, conservation, maintenance, and restoration. So what I want to highlight here is that against all this violence and this and ecological destruction, the strategy is then now this entity called the river, the Atrato River, will have the rights of protection, conservation, maintenance, and restoration. And you already saw the justifications for that. So this is the first step of the presentation. Now, this interdependence between humans and nature highlighted by this case was the inspiration for another court in Colombia to attribute rights to the Colombian Amazonia. So I want to present that in what follows. So again, if we recall the Wanganui saying is the river flows from the mountains to the sea. I am the river is me. And in my interpretation, I stands for 25 plaintiffs who represented the future generations. They sued the Colombian government and other authorities because of their failure protecting the Colombian Amazonia, violates their right to enjoy a healthy environment, and threatens their rights to live, to health, to food, and to water. I just want to give you an idea of the rigor of this argumentation. So I will show you a screenshot of the argumentation by the plaintiffs. And obviously I am not going to present these, but I wanted to show you how rigorous the plaintiffs were. And this argumentation has several levels of complexities and developments. I am not doing that. I want to focus on two main arguments, which are these two. So they justify that so to justify the claim that the rights were violated, the plaintiffs put forward two sub-arguments. The first one is that they justify that their right to enjoy a healthy environment was violated by the omissions and not compliance of the Colombian government and authorities to protect the Colombian Amazonia. And the second one was that they showed that these violations threatens the future generations' fundamental rights to live, to health, to food, and water. And obviously, a core of this argumentation is to understand why these people claim to be the future generation. So I want to present that argument before going to these two sub-arguments. So from their perspective, a generation is a group of people who, given their simultaneous historic experiences, share in some degree a worldview, a historic conscience, and a collective identity that is externalized in attitudes and behaviors. This common ground comes from the fact that, for the plaintiffs, that they are the generation that will face the greatest climate-related impacts, number one. And number two, unlike the present generation, let's say us, they do not have any power to make decisions that effectively reduce greenhouse emissions and the rate of deforestation in the Colombian Amazonia. So they have this common ground because, number one, they will suffer the impact, and then also they cannot make decisions to change the world because we are the decision makers right now, our generation. So this is obviously an argumentum ad hominem we teach in our logic classes. So I want you to meet the future generations. Is this which is a really important part of the argumentation. I will show it later, but So they are boys and girls and teenagers and young adults who are between 7 and 26 years old. This means that the average life expectancy is about 70 years old, and they will be develop more of their adult lives in the period between 2041 and 2070. And after that, they're old age. Which this is important for the argumentation because climate change obviously will take a toll on them, because according to the predictions of the Colombian Institute of Hydrology, Meteorology and Environmental Studies, which I'm quoting this because they quoted it, but also is the first time that one court takes, at least in Latin America, a scientific study to base a decision based on predictions of environment. So that makes this case extremely important. Thank you. 2 minutes. So so we know the story. 2020, 2041 and 2070 will be catastrophic. The increase in it will be around 1.6 Celsius and 2.14 Celsius of temperature increasing. And then that shows that the damage will be done on them. And that's why they are the future generation. Then I want to quickly go through the other two arguments. I won't stop too long here. So they show that the Colombian government didn't comply with their agreements. First, with the Paris Agreement of zero net deforestation by 2020, that didn't happen. And the cause is because the armed conflict in Colombia stopped, and then a lot of people immigrated to the Amazonic jungle because they can now, but the government didn't do anything to control that. And that created a lot of ecological destruction that I don't need to show here because I think you know that deforestation is bad for the Amazonic jungle. So I will move to the other argument and I will stop there. So then the strategy is to show that greenhouse emissions produced by deforestation fuel climate change, and that's a general claim. But then they prove in the case that individually, the increase of temperature in the world will affect each of them individually. So they have a file for each of the planets showing how their future will be diminished because of our present decisions. So just to use an example, because they use all these rights that I already mentioned, they use the right to live, and they say that that life is not, the right to live is not mere biological existence, but also a dignified life, which means the possibilities to develop a life plan and the ability to minimal condition of existence and physical and moral integrity. But with all the changes that are predicted with the environment, which we really don't know which changes are coming, which is the point, then they cannot make decisions for their future. And that will affect their right of living. And then obviously I can share this if you want to see the arguments in more detail. So I just want to finish saying that the court clearly said, you're right. And then the reaction was that the Colombian Amazonia is a right holder with the rights of protection, conservation, maintenance, and restoration again. So it uses the previous ruling to expand it to the Amazonic jungle. And this decision has been evaluated in multiple scenarios, and it seems to be, environmentally speaking, a example to the world, but I am working on that yet. So thank you. So the main claim is in this, at least in this part of environmental thought in Latin America, legal rights for rivers not only are justified in biocultural rights, but also in the rights for future generations. Thank you. Oh, sorry about the time.
That's okay. Thank you so much for that super interesting talk. There's a lot there, obviously. So we have about 8.5 minutes for questions. because I want to make sure we have time to have a little break before the next session. So if anybody has a question or a comment for Danny, go ahead and flail at the screen or raise your hand or whatever. Zachary.
Zach's fine. Either way, that
Okay,
works.
great. Zach, go for it.
Okay, so I guess mine is a comment that I'm going to turn into a question. I think this strategy of attributing rights to entities such as rivers is interesting, and I think there's a parallel there between something else that's been going on quite a lot in places like museums. Especially in art history literature, a little bit in continental philosophy, and in anthropology. There's been this strategy of trying to say, well, look, you have this artifact that the people who originally possessed it, that it was taken from, will allow you to keep and take care of, as long as you follow certain conditions. And some museums want to resist this and say, no, we don't have to do that. We already have the object, and why would we do this extra thing, whether that's allowing people to come in and perform a ritual associated with it, whether it's simply the museum itself, in some cases, like taking an object out into the sunlight temporarily. There's many such instances, so we need not worry about that. But one of the strategies that's been taken up is saying, well, no, these objects also have rights. That's just part of their materiality and their origin and things like that. I don't think that's exactly the same as what's going on in the case of attributing rights to the river here, but I wonder if you see any parallels in the examples, or if you think they're truly totally distinct. I could definitely see ways they come apart, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts along those lines, or if you considered if those might have some similarities in strategy.
Yeah, just so I think this is not part of the presentation today, but in India, the justification, what they do is they take religious idols, which were statues, physical objects, as you're saying, and they, because of their religious beliefs, they attributed rights to the statues because of the temples and the guardians, and they shouldn't be destructed because of the beliefs around the statue. And so once they do that, then the Supreme Court in India transferred. So they say the argumentation is more complicated than this, but I will say it. So they try to protect the temples and the images, and then the court say, well, if we do it with these subjects, we can do it with the river, which is contaminated. And I think that's the clear example of how they expand from an object to the river. The difference of the cases will be, I think, with Latin America, I think for the Indian court, Supreme Court, what they do is to say, well, the transition between this object and the river is that we use these legal figures called corporations. They are not people or subjects of protection, but this is a legal fiction that we do. So we attribute personality to companies, but they are not persons, legally, physically speaking. Or so we just pretend that they have rights and they have centers of decision making, and so that we can do a lot of legal stuff with them. So we will do this with the rivers. That is India, and the case was overturned, and they are still in the legal debate. And at this point, they don't know if the Ganges has rights or not, and the consequence that they will have to all the religious practices in that area. So that will be in Latin America. My intuition is that we have all these. We are recycling all these ideas of nature as an entity with life, which you've heard all the constitutions. So a big part of Latin American constitutions are taking this concept of Pachamama or Madre Tierra and attributing some sort of entity and living attributes to nature or parts of nature. So in this case, won't be transferring rights to an object, but attributing life properties to nature or parts of nature. But I think the case is India will be a good case of study, because all the argumentation is if this statue has rights, then the Ganges has right too. rights to. And I think I talked too much.
No, it's helpful. This is really like, it's such a great discussion. Does anybody else have a question? We have a couple more minutes. If anybody else wants to jump in there and question or comment, or Greg, go for it.
Sure. I just wanted to notice some trends here. Number one, the switch from Bill's presentation to this presentation goes from a sort of a global contract to indigenous rights. It seems to me that we don't want to lose track of how different these two approaches to the question are. The other thing is the way that this approach to the river is grounded in the it said beyond the biodiversity. So I think the language was mirrored biodiversity. And so we're looking here at a pretty radical shift of granting the river rights, but granting them on very much of a, what do they call it, anthrocentric in environmental ethics, on anthrocentric grounds. So I wonder really how much the rights are granted to the river or how much the rights have been conferred to the human beings. And then third, finally, as Bill suggested that we revisit our CPP documents and so forth, I think this presentation also asks us to make sure that we include land statements in our rituals.
So thank you. You put in words what I was thinking, what I was listening to the previous presentation. That was, I just didn't want to talk because I would have started talking about, so I will say this or I will say that. So, but yes, I saw those connections clearly. I don't, so in environmental ethics or thinking, we have this differentiation between anthropocentric views and views focused on nature. And as far as I've read, all this, especially the developments in Latin America, which is my research, they quote the distinction and they say, well, you are not transferring, so you are not transferring rights to the river, you are protecting human communities. But I don't think it's that the distinction in what in what we are trying to, or they are trying to do, is the distinction is fake. They kind of think of both together. You cannot transfer the right to the people without transferring the rights to the river or vice versa. So it is the distinction between focus on nature only or focus on humans only. At this point for me, it's a fake distinction, but I cannot justify it in a responsible way yet. You know, I think the categories don't match this, at least this kind of actions. Yes, and I like all the earth inclusion. I mean, I don't know the organization enough, but I am falling in love every day more. So let's see what happens at the end of this.
Yes, please stick with us. Awesome. All right. So thank you so much for that. I hate to cut us off, but in an effort to give everybody 10 minutes to get up from your chairs or go get some coffee or like twist your spine or whatever you need to do, please go do that. Our next session starts at 10:20 a.m. Central Time. That's 9:20 a.m. for the Rocky Mountains and 8:20 a.m. for those on the West Coast. And then on the East Coast, it's going to be 11:20 a.m. So please feel free to have a break and then hop back in 10:20 a.m. Central Time. We have even more awesome presentations coming up. Again, let's finish with a big round of applause for our speakers. Thank you so much. This is an awesome way to start a Friday.
Can I say something?
Yeah,
I am horrible at multitasking, and some people are chatting with me in the chat. I cannot respond right now, but I promise I will respond. I cannot look at the screen, and that was terrible when I was teaching during COVID. I cannot use the chat and see the screen at the same time, but I will respond, promise. Okay, thank you.
Okay, no, that's
thank you
awesome.
for helping us.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. So we all await with bated breath our Danny's